Skylab's Reentry will be awesome. 79 tons boring its way into the atmosphere like a shooting star, burning and breaking up into an estimated 500 pieces of molten metal, all streaking across the sky in a spectacular display of light. Publicly, America's space agency says there is only a very remote chance of Skylab crashing into a heavily populated area. But privately, some of the space agency officials are worried. At least one NASA official has resigned over the way that the United States has handled the disintegration of this, its largest satellite. The space station, which is about as big as a three-bedroom house, is in a crisscrossing orbit over 90% of the world's population, including Australia. Skylab will be travelling around 340 miles an hour, spreading wreckage over a corridor 100 miles wide and 4,000 miles long. This artist's impression depicts the slim possibility of wreckage crashing towards land. NASA was embarrassed by this picture and insisted that the chances of anyone being injured or killed were 1 in 150. NASA believe they will have at the most 3 days accurate warning of when Skylab will fall, but only about 2 hours' notice of where it will fall.
Tonight, in tracking stations across the world, in Spain, on Ascension Island, on Bermuda, in California, and in Chile, men and machines like these are tracking the last days, the last orbits of the space station called Skylab. For Skylab is falling.
How big is it, this Skylab? It's a bit hard to find an earthbound thing to compare it with, but as it was when it was launched, as it is now that it's in orbit, and as it will be when it falls out of that orbit, hits the Earth's atmosphere and begins to disintegrate, Skylab will be about the size of this, about as big as a railway locomotive.
So how is it that 70 tons of space technology, an object as big as a locomotive, is floating around in space out of control and about to make a fiery return to the Earth that launched it 6 years ago? That story goes back to 1973, to the beginning of Skylab's space odyssey. Skylab was the crowning achievement of the 10-year-long American preoccupation with space. 6 years ago now, the space station Skylab was built into the payload of an unmanned Saturn rocket and put into orbit around Earth. Its crews would board later in space. It was a workshop in space, a workshop, a laboratory, an observatory, taking a telescope beyond the atmosphere for a new look at deep space. Skylab was there, they thought, for 10 years, with crews moving in and out as part of an ongoing space program. But around 1974, the pace of American space exploration began to lag. The third Skylab crew was the last. They shut down the space station and left it in silent orbit. There was, they thought then, plenty of time to work out Skylab's future. But they forgot Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it will. And of course it did. 2 things went wrong. And together, they sentenced Skylab to the fiery death, now to occur one day next week. There was a period of intense flare activity on the surface of the sun. That could have been predicted. It was predicted and ignored. The sun began emitting more radiation, as it does regularly every 11 years. The Earth's atmosphere was slightly warmed, and it expanded, up ever nearer the orbital path of Skylab. The spacecraft was now meeting atmospheric resistance to its path. It began to slow down, and as it slowed, to fall slowly out of orbit. In the language of the spacemen, the orbit was decaying. And meanwhile, back on Earth, the space shuttle was having its problems. So Skylab rescue was out of the question. And what had gone up was certainly going to come down. It will be, the experts say, like a huge meteorite, a spectacular fireworks show. But where and when? The spacecraft crosses Australia 6 times a day. 5 of its orbits avoid centres of heavy population, but the 6th could hardly be worse positioned. It passes over Melbourne, Sydney and Newcastle once a day, every day. Elsewhere in the world, the potential for trouble is worse again.
Australia represents 2% of the total area of the globe in where it could come down. So as far as re-entry over Australia is concerned at this time, the probability is 1 in 50 that we could experience re-entry.
Stand by, please.
24 hours ahead of Skylab's predicted re-entry, an information centre will be set up at NASA's Canberra Communications Base.
Canberra, boys.
Canberra.
Return members.
Roger, copy.
From here, there's instant contact with the international NASA system. A minute-by-minute account of predicted events will be available. If, in the final 6 hours, an impact on Australia is judged to be possible, the warnings will go out from here on Australia's radio networks. But the odds for that are pure speculation, as the newspaper coverage so far has been.
Radio 1, Eastern Time is 11 o'clock.
The news in brief, read by Bruce Webster. Predictions are that the derelict American spacecraft Skylab will come to Earth in about 2.5 hours from now. American space officials say the 77-ton ship will probably begin breaking up over the northwest corner of the United States and Canada. Ground Control has sent its last signal to Skylab, a command aimed at sending the spacecraft into a tumble to retard its descent into the atmosphere. This was done to direct it down into an ocean, either the Southern Atlantic or the Indian.
Hello once again from Hugh Evans with another special Skylab Watch report, and perhaps we should begin this one with an update as we go across to reporter Jeff McMullen in Washington.
Good morning again, Australia. Luck so far seems to be with the Skylab controllers here in Washington by their manoeuvres earlier today, sending the space station into a tumbling motion. They believe they've prolonged its flight at least by another 18 minutes, giving it that extra time in the air, according to NASA, means a splashdown safely in the Atlantic Ocean within the next couple of hours. And Ian McIntosh in New York is having a look at how Americans are reacting to this.
Well, here in New York, it's pretty much business as usual on what is a muggy summer morning. And like Washington and other American cities, all seems fairly normal. There's no great fuss being made at this stage over Skylab. That hasn't stopped, of course, some Americans from expressing their idea of individuality on Skylab. One New York restaurant organised a Skylab re-entry party and promoted a Skylab cocktail. Drink a couple and you won't know what's hit you. Over the last few days, American newsmen have been making a lot of the prospect that Skylab would disintegrate over ocean and less populated areas. They've specifically mentioned Australia, which prompted one American woman who's lived in Australia to call us here at the ABC's New York office and apologise for any impression that we might have got that Australia was considered a target by Washington.
And with me in the Sydney studio is Dr. David Cole, who's Director of the Ionospheric Prediction Service of the Department of Science and the Environment. It's now, 11:34 nearly p.m. in eastern Australia. Where is Skylab now?
Skylab, as we reckon at the moment, has passed beyond Madagascar down the southern Indian Ocean, is now working its way up towards the south of Tasmania, where it'll pass south of Tasmania, go across the Pacific, and then carry on up towards the United States on its last orbit round, or what we expect to probably be its last orbit.
Right, so it goes from Tasmania up across the Pacific to the United States and then comes round the other side.
Correct.
There was a time a little earlier on where it was thought that if it did make its re-entry later, there could still be large pieces landing in Australia. Does it look as if that could still happen?
It's most unlikely at this stage. It certainly looks as if everything is going to go as planned, and it's going to come down round about the Atlantic Ocean, mid to South Atlantic.
Yeah. And now, what's going to happen when it does make its re-entry and starts burning up? I mean, we've seen pictures of it with the bits and pieces outside. What's going to fall off first, as it were, and come crashing down?
Well, the NASA have predicted a marvellous program of bits and pieces falling off. They talk about at 92 kilometres height that the solar panel will rip off. This is sort of the windmill.
Well, those the four blades.
The sort of windmill on top of the Skylab. That tends to be ripped off. At 80 kilometres, I expect all telescopes will go. At 76 kilometres, the multi-docking adapter will be ripped off. And around about 70 kilometres, the lab, the sleeping quarters, and so on, start to break up.
You're with ABC Radio 1 and ABC Radio 3 plus Radio Australia. And in Australia, Eastern Time, 2 a.m.
Here is a special Skylab report from the Space Center in Washington. According to a late report from space officials here, Skylab has re-entered the atmosphere and is expected to splash down in the Indian Ocean south of Africa within half an hour. Latest estimates are that it will be 17 minutes past 2 Australian Eastern Time. However, a spokesman told me there was a possibility that Skylab could remain aloft till 2:53 a.m. And this would cause concern because there was a slight chance, he emphasized slight, that this could take the tumbling spacecraft over Australia. He emphasized that this was not expected, that the drama was likely to be over within half an hour.
Just been handed a press cable. Skylab began to disintegrate at 2:10 Eastern Australian Time today as it made a fiery descent through the Earth's atmosphere, plunging towards the Atlantic or Indian Oceans, according to US space officials. OK, well, we'll leave our Skylab report there. We'll be back in about 5 minutes' time from Public Affairs. It's 23 minutes past 2.
Skylab has impacted at 42 degrees 87 minutes south, 105 degrees 0.97 minutes east, which puts it off the southwest corner of Australia. This is a preliminary estimate by NORAD. Degrees again, 42 degrees 87 minutes south, 105 degrees 97 minutes east in the southern Indian Ocean, southwest the coast of Australia. This information will be updated as we get refined data from the Air Force. At 11:39 a.m. Central Daylight Time, this is Skylab Control.
OK, we'll leave it there. We'll be crossing to Western Australia in about 3 minutes' time. In the meantime, it's back to John Hall.
Oh yes, the Vogue's Eastern Time at 11 minutes to 3. I don't want your arms around me. No, not much. Instead, perhaps, you'll settle for Steve Cosser.
Thank you, John. 10.5 minutes to 3, Australian Eastern Time. Right, we cross now to Jeff McMullen in Washington for the official confirmation of Skylab splashdown.
The Skylab Control Center in Washington now confirms that the space station has fallen harmlessly into the Indian Ocean, several hundred miles off the southwest corner of Australia. The return to Earth was at 2:38 a.m. Australian Eastern Time. According to the director of the Skylab Recovery Project, Mr. Richard Smith, the heaviest parts of the space station have fallen into the ocean, with the lighter pieces scattered back across a flight path towards Africa. That's the latest from the Skylab Control Center, where there is a mood something resembling an Irish wake. It's not exactly jubilation, it's a sense of relief, but there is some celebration that Skylab is back to Earth safely.
Jeff McMullen, many thanks. As we mentioned, it was flying over Esperance in Western Australia. A few moments ago, Jim Bonner spoke to a coordinator with the State Emergency Service in Western Australia, Phil Arledge.
We've seen about uncounted numbers, say somewhere between 50 and 100 pieces carrying on a northeasterly direction from here.
How high did it look to be up in the sky?
Your guess is as good as mine, but it would probably be, well, anywhere to 50,000 feet. We wouldn't know. We had nothing to compare it with.
How big were these pieces, would you say?
Oh, quite bright lights in the sky.
And did they take long to pass over?
No, they were passing over fairly quickly. I would say a minute and a half and they'd be out of sight.
Were there long streaks of light in the sky?
There was a sonic boom here also. The boom came about 3 minutes behind the light.
Dr. David Coles, is it possible that what Phil Arledge saw was Skylab?
Well, as far as we know, the majority of Skylab came down well off the coast of Western Australia. I don't honestly know what he saw, what he didn't see. But certainly, as far as we know, it's come down in the Indian Ocean. It hasn't produced any danger to anybody, and I think we need to be thankful for that.
The American Skylab space mission has crashed to Earth. The latest details from Peter Barnett in Washington.
Details at this point are still sketchy during what has been a tense and dramatic finale to this 71-ton space station. Officials here became concerned when Skylab failed to disintegrate as quickly as predicted. At 14 minutes past 2 Australian time, Skylab was reported over Ascension Island in the Atlantic Ocean. Then contact was lost. Everything went dead. At that point, its heavy sails had burnt off and the disintegration process had begun much later than expected. The next news, the official announcement, came less than half an hour ago, indicating that the splashdown occurred about 2:30 Australian Eastern Time. Further details are still being flashed to Washington at this hour. And there's one final point that the Space Agency has reported sightings of debris over Australia which may be related to the disintegration of Skylab. That's as much as they're saying at the space headquarters in Washington at this time. Peter Barnett in Washington.
Okay, it's 5.5 minutes past 3 Eastern Australian time. There's a fairly elated atmosphere in the Skylab Control Centre at the moment in Houston. A press conference is taking place, and we'll cross to that now.
Well, we performed a maneuver last night to keep it in orbit somewhat longer than it would have been, and it looks like the maneuver was perhaps over-successful. Instead of coming in the South Atlantic as we expected, it appears, according to the latest North American Air Defense Command estimate, to have come in the Indian Ocean. In fact, according to our tracking map, Skylab barely missed the coast of Australia. That's right. It looks like it's several hundred miles southwest of the coast of Australia.
The question is that going to place Australia in the footprint of debris from Skylab?
That's right. It could, Bob. I think at this point what we have to do is wait for any visible sightings from Australia. If there are none, then we can only assume that all of the debris came into the Indian Ocean.
Well, there's the answer to the question, why did Skylab take a little longer to come to Earth? The manoeuvre which took place last night to keep the spacecraft up in the air. We're getting a lot of phone calls from Western Australia from people who saw Skylab's re-entry. We'll take a few of them now. If you'd like to call us, if you saw it, 02, the Sydney code, 358 5000. And we'll take our first caller now. Hello.
Yes, hello.
Hello, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Perth.
I see. And what did you see this evening?
Low in the southern sky, I saw 5 large glowing white objects spread over a fair distance horizontal in the sky.
What time was this?
I saw it somewhere between 12:30 and 12:35 West Australian time.
So you add 2 hours for people in the east. How long were they in the sky for?
Roughly about 2 minutes.
And what happened to them?
As I watched them after about a minute, the 5 large chunks broke up and spread out in the sky into a large number of very small pieces.
Okay, we'll leave it there because we're getting quite a few calls from Western Australia. Thank you for joining us this morning. 358 5000 is the number. Hello.
At about just after 12:30.
Mm-hmm.
Very well lit. It seemed to be coloured in parts, long streaks of light with shooting stars in front of it. It passed right over our house. In fact, it just seemed to be not very far above the trees.
And for how long was that in the sky? The people we've spoken to before have talked about 1 or 2 minutes.
No, I should say about 1 minute.
About a minute.
And then after it had passed over, we had the sonic boom like thunder.
Tell me, had you stayed up specially to see it?
Yes, we did.
And what was your reaction?
Oh, most excited. Too excited to be frightened. Absolutely fascinated by the sight of it. It was a wonderful sight.
Well, thank you for calling us from Esperance. I gather we've got time for just one more call, so we'll take that one now. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, what did you see?
I'm calling you from Salmon Gum,
Which is where?
60 miles north of Esperance.
Uh-huh.
I was listening to the radio, and I thought, I'll just wander outside. It'd be 1,000,000 to 1 chance that I'd see anything. But I was terribly excited to see these bright lights, various colours. There were little flashes of green and orange and red among them. They were travelling in a northeasterly direction on a downward slope. I don't think that there's any doubt about the fact that if some of those pieces survived, they must hit the continent of Australia. I rushed inside to ring up, and I was most frustrated. I couldn't get anybody, and you people were crossing to America, and they were saying that it's going here and it's going there, and I'd just seen the damn thing falling, you know.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing your experience with us this morning. We'll have to leave it there, and I'm afraid we'll have to leave all the calls there. Thanks for joining us, and thank you to everybody who took the trouble to ring us in Sydney. 21 minutes past 3 Eastern Australia time. Seems to be some confusion. NASA saying most of it fell in the Indian Ocean. A lot of people in Western Australia are under the impression that at least some of it fell on their state. Five and a half minutes past 3 Eastern Australian time. That press conference is still going on at NASA. Let's cross to it now.
I thought I heard you say something about overflying Australia. Well, the sightings were in several of the Australian cities that they saw hot objects at night there in the air, and I assume they would be flying, that would be on the southern, southwestern part of Africa, still in the air. I would assume it would still be landing up track or down track farther, or up across Australia. And there's obviously the chance that debris could have come down in Australia. But there were several reported sightings of multiple objects going to basically the right direction from several cities. So you have to be suspicious that, yes, they did see some stuff.
And we leave the press conference there at 3:30 Eastern Australia time. I gather we can now cross to Mr. Tony Ball of the West Australian State Emergency Service.
How frequent are the reports been coming into you people?
We got flooded with them shortly after 12:30 tonight, virtually from Perth right through to the south coast. We've had reports from Balladonia, which is on the air highway, unconfirmed at this stage, indicating that visual sightings appear to indicate that smaller pieces have been striking the land somewhere in that area.
Have you had any other reports of any of the debris actually hitting Australia?
Nothing confirmed at this stage, but it's almost certain that this is the case.
Tony Ball of the West Australian State Emergency Service talking to Jim Bonner. A reminder that you can hear AM at 8 o'clock on ABC Radio 1 and 3. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.
This station is now closing down. ABC Radio 1, 2BL in Sydney, and Radio 3 through New South Wales regional stations, we bid you good night.
The race is on for a bit of Skylab. The San Francisco Examiner is offering a $10,000 reward for the first person to give them a piece of Skylab. The offer was made by columnist Jeff Jarvis a couple of weeks ago, but when Steve Futterman talked to him just a short time ago, it appears they're looking for a new Phileas Fogg.
We are offering $10,000 to the first person who comes to this office in San Francisco, the Examiner, with an authentic piece of Skylab, and we are serious. The check is already made out.
What would you advise people in Southwest Australia to do right now, then?
I would say they should be out looking for Skylab. They have 72 hours from the time it fell to get here. The deadline for the contest for the race is 10:08 Pacific Daylight Time here, Saturday, our time.
Do you hope someone wins the prize?
Yeah,
Yeah, we really do hope somebody in Australia finds it. We'd like to come here and have them come here and hear their story. I'm sure it'll be interesting.
So you are rooting for someone to find it?
That we are, a new Phineas Fogg from Australia.
And if you want to get it to the San Francisco Examiner, you have to be there by 4:08 on Sunday morning, Australian time.
Laurie, can you tell us how you found this piece of what looks like Skylab wreckage?
Well, yesterday, or it started on Wednesday night when nuclear police contacted the telecom technician at Royal Dinner and said there was a fella who had got off a bus last Saturday and was walking between Cocklebiddy and Royal Dinner, which is a distance of 90 miles. So we decided to go out yesterday morning to see if we could find him. And in the process, we only about 10 kilometres out of Royal Dinner, and we found this fibrous material about 10 or 12 feet off the track. We actually had gone past it, and we had heard on a previous news service that somebody down on the coast had found the same type of fibrous material. So we backpedalled, had a look, and found a bit of a crater. Only about a foot deep, it was about 7 or 8 feet wide.
So you could see that the piece had actually landed?
Oh, yes. We thought there might have been other pieces around, and we thought we saw about 500 metres away from where we were standing, it was a rather distorted-looking tree stump. Anyway, we decided we'd have a look at close look at it, so we drove across to it, and we found it was that cylinder.
What about the question of ownership? Has that been sorted out yet?
No. We've got it, so I suppose we've got a fair show.
You're taking legal advice, though?
Yes.
If ownership does come to you and the two other men who found it, what will you do with the wreckage?
Well, it hasn't been decided yet. We haven't we haven't stopped for 2 minutes since we found it yesterday. We took 3 hours to load it. We no sooner got back to town and we had to get on to state emergency, and then from then on we've had the media.
Yeah, has it occurred to you that it might be worth some money?
Well, we've heard plenty of figures bandied around, but...
Such as?
Well, there was this crowd in Hong Kong who was going to give an ounce of gold for an ounce of Skylab. Well, that, what we got out of there weighs about 750 kilograms, so a lot of
you could be set for life.
Yeah. And then we heard that NASA had offered $98,000, but we got onto the American ambassador, and apparently that wasn't the story, wasn't true.
I had intended to introduce the object with the phrase, "This is it." But having just looked at it, I'm tempted now to turn that into a question and ask, is this it? Can this really be part of the celebrated Skylab? This thing that looks like a demolished plywood water tank with singed emu feathers? Oh, man of little faith that I am, I wonder, does Arthur C. Clarke know?
Skylab relics have shown they can make money, in this case for the Kalgoorlie Women's Refuge. Given time, they may even work miracles. But right now the question is, who owns the pieces? NASA is quoted as saying Skylab is US government property. And then again, anyone can keep the pieces and put them on their coffee table. And most recently they've said that they only want to borrow some bits. For its part, the government in Perth doesn't know the answer, but someone high up is concerned enough for there to be a modest police guard in the Kalgoorlie Town Hall. And of course it's a matter that worries Laurie Hotstone, Peter Ralphs and Bill Norton of Rawlinna, who found the first big piece.
Well, we rang up State Emergency Services, and they apparently had NASA boys down there, and I explained, described the object to them, and he came back to us and said, yes, they say it's, you've got a piece of Skylab, and as far as they're concerned, it's yours. That's what they told me over the phone from the very first interview.
Of course, people do think, rightly or wrongly, that you three blokes want to make some cash on this. Now, is that the situation? Would you like to?
Well, I think, yes, there is money involved, and that's enough. We'd like to make some money. But I don't think that, at the moment, that's not a particular worry. It's the fact that somebody can turn around and say the complete opposite, that it's no longer yours.
But let's put it another way. I mean, the Americans put the wretched thing up in space in the first place, didn't they? Yeah. And now it's down, fell down. You think they still don't own it?
Well, if they did own it and they were that concerned, why didn't they have sort of recovery teams on the spot?
Well, presumably if they wanted it, why didn't they drop it back in America? That's right. Then they wouldn't have had to come charging over here and to collect it.
But from my reading of the situation, it was almost slightly accidental that it fell almost on top of you people. You don't believe that?
I don't believe it, for one.
Why not?
I mean, if they can put a thing like that with such precision up there, similarly with their moonshots and that, it's, it strikes me as a bit strange that they lose control of it on its way back.
Accident or not, ever since the three found their Skylab piece, there's been a good chance of them making some money. But each day the uncertainty about the ownership drags on, Skylab becomes older news, saleability lessens. Meantime, Kalgoorlie's mayor, who knows a good thing, can only be described as sympathetically ecstatic.
And I would like the control of it to be in the best interests of those three young men, because they're very, very fine young people.
Of course, in the best interest of Kalgoorlie too, because it's obviously going to be something of a money spinner for the town, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's quite a possibility. It's brought us some attention, has been focused on this region in the last little while, because it has to be accepted, you know, that Kalgoorlie is also part of Western Australia. That's a very important thing.
Of course, as we know by now, Skylab's blazing re-entry, its fiery descent and whatever else it did, attracted considerable attention in the press outside Western Australia. But even given that, I was surprised to see in Kalgoorlie a representative of the Toorak Times, and that is, of course, if you didn't know, Toorak, Melbourne, Australia. The representative was Mr. John Somerville Smith, whose normal duty is the reporting of the vagaries of the citizens of the nation's twin capitals, Toorak and Canberra. So why was he on the Eastern Goldfields, and why was he here so early?
Well, there was no other reason. I was told on the Friday week before in Melbourne that Skylab was going to land in the Laverton area, which is about 240 miles from Kalgoorlie here, and then this particular area would be in excess of 40 miles the other side of Laverton.
Let me get that clear. While the whole world was buzzing with speculation as to where this thing was going to land, you reckon that you knew from some source in Melbourne where it was going to land?
Yes, I knew about 4 o'clock on the Friday week beforehand.
Who told you?
Well, one of the same people that told me here in Kalgoorlie 2 years and 9 months before that Skylab by that time had been up almost 3 years, and they were talking about the American budget as to how long they could keep the spaceship up in the air, because the budget had been cut down, and they no doubt were thinking about bringing it down to cut expenditure ever since.
Well, forgive me for being just a little bit cynical. How is it that you, John Somerville Smith, were in such a privileged position in Kalgoorlie 2 years and 9 months ago?
Well, I was at a rather unusual establishment in Kalgoorlie
right?
until 3 in the morning, and there were 3 Americans enjoying the same hospitality, which was not what you're thinking, of course. It had something to do with fluid, and they were talking to me about where I had been and why I was over at Kalgoorlie.
And where he'd been, according to Somerville Smith, appealed immediately to the Americans as a place to bring down Skylab without loss of life. Like the 3 men from Rawlinna, Somerville Smith believes NASA always had control of Skylab. Furthermore, he reckons the biggest and best parts are still to be found near Laverton. And if you think all that's outrageous, how about this advice to the finders?
When everybody has held on to what they have got, I think the Yanks should be then screwed to pay everybody most reasonable compensation, something like, well, they scared 14 million Australians, so I think they should be asked to pay at least $100 fare money to every Australian, and probably $1,000 fare money to the people in the Kalgoorlie district.
Which leads us to those very people in the Kalgoorlie district and their views on their biggest story since gold.
I don't think it belongs to the Yanks, do you? I think it's finding and keeping in this country.
Yeah. And what do you think about it coming down in Western Australia?
I think it was well planned to come down where there was no one living.
Well, I suppose it belongs to the Americans, doesn't it?
Why do you say that, huh?
Well, I mean, they launched it. It was theirs in the first place.
You don't think that whoever found it should own it?
I don't really know. I suppose they should, finders, keepers.
So you're having a little bit both ways?
Yeah, I sort of, I think, well, if the Americans claim it, it's theirs, but I mean, the men that found it, I suppose they've got just as much claim to it.
I don't really think it's been guarded sufficiently.
We saw someone pull
a
piece off it.
Yeah.
There now. I think that's
and this
terrible.
is probably why I'm worked up at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean,
You're worked up, are you?
That somebody, that
somebody
somebody
comes and yanks a piece off it.
Yeah.
Well, if you did and you did, all of us that are here, we
There
all
wouldn't
had
be
a piece.
anything
There wouldn't be much left by the time that they required it for further investigation, and I presume that's what it's here for.
Oh, I feel the Americans knew it was going to land here. They knew far more than they made out they knew.
Why do you think that?
Well, they just played it down. They knew if it was going to land in Australia, it'd be a big hoo-ha.
So all along you reckon that they knew where they were going to put it down?
Definitely, yeah.
Not us. It doesn't belong to us.
You think it belongs to the Americans? You think it was a bit
Oh, right on the spot, me. No, I reckon it's a bit foul of the septics, really, to drop it on Australia. I think they probably did it deliberately.
The Americans did it deliberately?
Yeah.
You just
That's
think
my
that?
opinion.
Yeah, and you're sticking to it?
Yeah,
Good
for
on
sure.
You. Thanks, mate.
No worries.
Today's news conference began with questions that have been asked repeatedly since the space station came down last week. Did NASA have a plan to bring Skylab back to Earth over Australia? The officials emphasised their wish to have seen the derelict craft come down harmlessly in the ocean, and said in any event, NASA's decisions had been intended to keep it on an orbit that would present the least danger to human life. The team leader, Mr. Robert Gray, said that at the time of Skylab's launching, scientists had considered a payload of fuel aboard the craft to allow a controlled re-entry. However, this alternative was dropped because of the increased danger to astronauts who worked in the space station. Mr. Gray said NASA was by no means happy that Skylab had come down over land rather than water.
It was our hope, and I'll repeat it, that we would never see it again and it would land in the ocean.
Can you tell us why it's so important to have the pieces sent to you then?
No, it's not important to have the pieces sent to us. There are a very few pieces which are of scientific interest, because after all, this material has been in outer space for 6 years. That has a certain effect on the materials, and in a very few instances they'd like to take some pieces back, borrow them if you will, and analyze what exactly occurred to the material while it was in space. There's another purpose involved in this too. Obviously NASA had a sort of an idea of how this thing would break up, what pieces would come down where along the track that it came in. Since it unfortunately hit on the land area, this gives them the opportunity to see, as they examine where it hit, how it broke up and how precisely it fell in, so they can compare that with their computer analysis of what would have what they thought would have occurred.
Would you agree that if Skylab had crashed on the American continent, it could have been disastrous for the American space program?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. Obviously, if it impacts on any landmass, it would have a problem. But I think it's worth noting in this context that when Reentry started, 48 hours before this thing came in, it was on a track or a series of orbits that really had the least risk to human life. Had it been on a more dangerous orbit, and the most dangerous orbit it could have been on was one that did not have it going over North America at all. It would have had it going over Europe, over India, and over China. NASA had planned, with the concurrence of the top level of the United States government, that if it was on that orbit when Reentry appeared likely, or looked like it was coming down on that, they'd initiate a procedure to put it on an orbit with less risk to human life that would have had it coming over the North American continent.
After the press conference, the group visited the ABC to view film of debris found by a prospector east of Kalgoorlie. Space scientist Dr. Raymond Gauss did his best to identify the wreckage.
Well, judging only from the film that you are showing me, I would have to say that it possibly could be one of the nitrogen pressurized spheres that we had on the spacecraft. After we once analyze it and see it and observe it in person, we would be able to come up with more positive identification.
Knowing whereabouts on the craft those tanks would be located, and if it is in fact one of those, could you judge where other debris might have landed?
Yes, we could. Mr. Billy Adair, who's with us, is familiar with predicted areas where, knowing where this one was located, knowing how many others we had, we could have a fair idea of where we might expect to find the others. We expected possibly to find something like the oxygen tank, a nitrogen sphere similar to this. So that's not surprising based upon what our predictions were. It's surprising that we find them on land because we expected them to be in the ocean.
People of Esperance would like to donate this to the National Geographical Society in Washington in America, because it appears that they have a museum over there that has such fantastic exhibits, and being an organisation that will publicise this and look after it for posterity, people of Esperance think that the best place for this would be in their museum. If you can arrange that for us.
I certainly will. I'll be going next Friday, and I'll be only too happy to present them with this, and on behalf of the people of Esperance, and just put it into their museum. I think that they will really enjoy having this.
The latest discovery has, to some extent, kept the Skylab saga alive, and for the three men who found the wreckage, it couldn't have come at a better time. They plan to organise camping tours for Americans in the area where the spacecraft came down, and were surveying the route when the debris was found. Although the American Space Agency, NASA, has not yet identified the object as a piece of Skylab, its finders and staff from the University of Western Australia have no doubt that it's authentic. Mr. Ralph Hoger explains how he came across the wreckage.
Well, we were in a vehicle, and the driver just stopped the bus, and we discussed, right, 1 o'clock we'll have lunch. And it was 20 minutes to go, and so we just headed off in different directions, and I wandered off in the opposite direction to my other two colleagues, and wandered about looking for bits of Skylab, you might say. And from there, actually, I passed over a vehicle track, and straight away I realised, well, I'm not going to find anything here. There's obviously, you know, a lot of people been through the area. And so I just put my mind in neutral, and the next minute I just walked around the corner or just looked down, and bang, there it was in the bush.
So you knew straight away what it was, did you?
Well, yes, I lit up. I thought, this is it, you know, that's actually a piece of Skylab. I mean, the metal of it and the seat shape straight away, I thought to myself, well, it's not just a bit of tin or galvanised iron. And seeing it, you know, the hot seat of it, I thought straight away, this is a piece. And I was really excited.
What are you going to do with it now?
Well, I'm going to use it to promote tourism in Western Australia. I'm, you know, a tour planner, and we went up there with the intention to plan a tour for the American market to come out into Skylab country. And this sort of confirms more of the planning idea that, you know, there is bits of Skylab up there.
Esperance had been told a week earlier that there was a possibility it could be heading in this direction, but they were told it's going to land in the ocean. So where I am standing today on Wireless Hill, a few people gathered hoping to catch a glimpse of it. But a lot of people were told, go home, it's in the ocean already, and of course that was wrong. So a lot of debris was scattered over hundreds of kilometres in this region, the largest being an oxygen tank, which was the size of a car. So when we spoke to the Shire President earlier this week, he said it's really miraculous that no one was injured. There was no major destruction of buildings, and it was really just a big international publicity stunt for the town of Esperance. NASA came down within days to sort of inspect the debris and answer a lot of questions from the Australian media. But by this point, a lot of people had started collecting the debris, mostly scrap metal, for their own souvenirs or trying to sell it off. In a bizarre twist of events, a newspaper in San Francisco offered $10,000 to the first person who could return a piece of Skylab to the US. The winner of that competition was a 17-year-old boy. So there was a bit of a crazy race around here trying to get bits and pieces of this former space station. And also the Esperance Shire thought they would try and hand a $400 littering fine to NASA, which of course was never paid. The Esperance Museum has one of the largest collections of Skylab debris in the world, and it attracts tourists all the time throughout the year. So that collection is really being highlighted this week. There's a lot of history talks as well this week. And Skylab has inspired all types of art. So this week there's an art exhibition, a novel is being talked about by the author this week. There's a documentary screening, and they're rescreening a French movie called Le Skylab. So it's pretty clear that this really bizarre story has really cemented its place in Esperance's history, and it's not going to be forgotten anytime soon.